I'm happy to introduce our second speaker, Yossi Chajes, who is a Sir Isaac Wolfson Professor of Jewish Thought at the University of Haifa. He received his PhD from Yale University in 1999 and has been a visiting professor at Queen Mary University London, the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, and the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. And he has also been a fellow at the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies in Jerusalem, at Goethe University Frankfurt, and the Katz Center at the University of Pennsylvania. Chajes's pioneering work has been awarded 4 Israel Science Foundation grants, the Friedenberg Prize for the Outstanding Project in the Humanities, and 2 Volkswagen Foundation grants to develop the digital humanities project, Maps of God, Building a Portal to Visual Kabbalah. His recent book, The Kabbalistic Tree, has been lauded in Library Journal as a monumental achievement that will be valuable to scholars and general readers interested in Judaism, religion, and art history. Today, Yossi will be joining us virtually from Israel, and his talk will be Religion, Science, and the Magic of the Kabbalistic Tree.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Miracles of technology. So assuming that you can hear me, I'll continue and open by thanking Catherine for the kind invitation, which I hoped would be possible to accept with physical participation in Hartford, but my schedule during the teaching term here became too impossible to make a trip back to the States feasible. So I do appreciate the consolation prize of dropping in on you virtually for this presentation. And it was hard to resist an invitation to a Tree of Life conference, especially one taking place so soon after the publication of my book on the Kabbalistic tree. So that said, it also is the case that I'm coming with a somewhat rigorous historical academic orientation to the presentation, and have some, I don't know, I wouldn't say bad news, but at the risk of ruining the romantic environment of a conference on the Tree of Life, I have to begin with my commitment to do no harm, in this case, meaning don't be deceptive about what the historical record actually shows, even though people might want to hear about the Kabbalistic Tree of Life. I will tell you more about the Kabbalistic tree and explain to you where it came from, but unfortunately, when I perhaps, maybe not unfortunately, it depends on your expectations, but if I ask the rhetorical question, is there or is the Kabbalistic tree a tree of life? I'm afraid I have to give the short answer. No, it's not actually. And that the identification of the Kabbalistic tree and the tree of life is not something that one finds in actual Jewish Kabbalistic sources. And so along these rather sacred cow slaughtering lines, I just want to make a couple of short introductory negative remarks. The first one being that if you look up Tree of Life and disambiguate and through Wikipedia to get to the Kabbalah entry on the Tree of Life, everything in the entry that you read will be wrong or is wrong, other than one external link at the bottom if you make it all the way to the bottom of that page. So one way of seeing that the entry on the Kabbalistic Tree of Life has very little to do with historical Jewish Kabbalah is by checking the footnotes on the Wikipedia page And doing so allows one to see in a moment that there is hardly a reference to a Jewish source that is invoked in this entry. And indeed, I won't dedicate much time to it, but Dr. Landau was correct in pointing to the Christian interest in highlighting the tree of life and its associations with the cross. But this is a much more Christian association than it is a Jewish one. And as a result, you could say it's mostly Christians who've been looking to make the connection between the Kabbalistic tree and the so-called tree of life. One of the most upsetting academic articles in my world is by the Assyriologist Simo Parpola, who published in 1993 an astoundingly ridiculous article called The Assyrian Tree of Life, Tracing the Origins of Jewish Monotheism in Greek Philosophy. In a proper academic journal, this was before some people tested just how ridiculous a claim could be made and submitted to an academic journal in the humanities and get it published. But this is an early example of publishing absolute nonsense. And Professor Parpola, who I understand and have been told by my Assyriologist colleagues is actually quite a serious Assyriologist, has had a really unbelievable blind spot on this issue and published this article in which he compared antique Assyrian images of the tree of life with what he believed was the Kabbalistic tree. And in a manner akin to that seen on the Wikipedia page, just mentioned assembled evidence of the sort that you can see on this page or these 2 pages from the article. I suppose the 2 pages can compete for their degree of untenability or irrelevance to actual historical connections between the Kabbalistic tree and the Assyrian tree. But I just want to point out that his knowledge of the Kabbalistic tree is based on primarily on the works by 16th and 17th century Christian figures. So some might be called Christian Kabbalists, but that's actually problematic, even specifically with regard to those here invoked, but also by the modern author Charles Poncet, whose works include the book on Kabbalah that apparently Professor Parpola consulted, and other books on the I Ching and Jungian archetypes. Parpola thus based his assertions with regard to the Kabbalistic tree and its tree of life origins in the Assyrian tree of life on Kircher, Athanasius Kircher, the famous 17th century man who knew everything, Guillaume Postel, Robert Flood, and again, those 6 images from Poncet. So now you've all seen that I'm a crabby old man here. I have a little more crabbiness to share with you before I move on to positive content. It's not as though one could very easily open up scholarship treating the history of Kabbalah or Jewish mysticism more broadly and find information with regard to the Kabbalistic tree. For over a century of scholarship in Jewish studies on Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism, basically, images of the Kabbalistic tree were little more than eye candy for authors when it came time to publish your book and choose a cover. You opened up your manuscripts or the equivalent and chose something, sent it to a graphic designer, and put it on the cover of your book. Even the great Gershom Scholem and his wonderful encyclopedia articles, first published in the German Encyclopedia Judaica and then later in the Hebrew and English editions of the Encyclopedia Judaica, he chose marvelous illustrations for his main article, Kabbalah, but the article itself doesn't actually say anything about any of the illustrations. They are literally 100% eye candy. And therefore, until very recently, there was simply nothing to read about it that was responsible to actual manuscripts and in history. So that situation changed with the publication in 2005 of Giulio Busi's Italian monograph on visual Kabbalah. But even Busi's monograph was on visuality more generally and didn't include a particular focus on the Kabbalistic tree. Kabbalistic trees, such as they are, and well, now for the rest of the presentation, I will not tell you bad things about other people, but try and focus on what Kabbalistic trees actually are, what they do. But Kabbalistic trees are visualizations of the relationships between the Sfirot. And I'm leaving it untranslated at the moment, but the Sfirot being the constitutive Kabbalistic concept. If you want to know, one reading a Jewish text, if it's a Kabbalistic text, well, one good way of finding out is to see whether it's interpreting things through the prism of the Sphirotic system. And so let me just give a very quick introduction to what I mean when I say the Sfirot. I can't assume everybody knows what I'm talking about, but the term Sfirot was coined by a pre-Kabbalistic, but nevertheless esoteric Jewish work by the name of Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation, the Book of Creation, the Book of Creativity, as you choose to translate it. And this is a book, the provenance of which is still debated. People, there are serious scholars who think it was written in the 2nd century, and others who think it was written in the 8th century. So I won't get into that, but it is a pre-Kabbalistic work that's a cosmological, magical, astrological text, and it uses the term Sfirot primarily in the sense of things that can be numbered. And in its cosmological assertion, states that there are 10 fundamental numbered things that reality is made of. And it's very insistent that there are 10, as you can see in this quote. There are 10 things that are without substance, 10, not 9, 10, not 11. So the Sefer Yetzirah, in its axiomatic, apodictic kind of language, established the idea that there were 10 Sfirot. What did Sefer Yetzirah mean when it used the term Sfirot? The best way to find out is by reading Sefer Yetzirah and seeing what it actually said. And what it actually said was that the 10 are 6, the 6 dimensions of 3, the 6 dimensions or the 6 directions of 3-dimensional space. You could say northwest, east, south, and up and down, cubic space. The 2 dimensions of time, or vectors of time, probably better, beginning and end, and the 2 vectors of value. Sefer Yetzirah uses the term omek when it refers to these 10 counted things. Omek means depths. So that says the depths of north, the depths of south, the depth of the beginning, the depth of the end, the depth of good, the depth of bad. So space is the world. And of course, beginning and end are time, and value, good and bad, are not things that exist in space or time, but subjective values of human subjects. So basically have space, time, human as the fundamental categories of reality. And those are the 10 counted things, or sfirot. But that's not what the Kabbalists meant when they used the term hundreds of years later. They transvalued the term and still refer to Sefer Yetzirah as their authority, but it no longer means these things to the Kabbalists. The 10 sfirot of the Kabbalah are categories or attributes of the divine. They are the modes of divine being, the categories through which the divine interfaces with creation. And so they include what the Kabbalists call the sfirot of wisdom, understanding, love, beauty, strength, endurance, splendor, foundation, and kingdom. And you're seeing, I hope that this projection enables you to make out some of the inscriptions here and my additional Latin character inscriptions. But what you're seeing is an Ilan. You're seeing a Kabbalistic tree that is inscribed with the Kabbalistic names of the 10 sfirot, these 10 categories or attributes of the divine that are basically the key through which Kabbalists understand both scripture and nature, in fact, all of reality. So these are the 10 sfirot of the Kabbalah, and the visualization of these 10 sfirot is basically the starting point of the Kabbalistic tree. And so a real question for Kabbalists was, okay, if the divine interface with reality, the means through which the sort of philosophical, infinite, incomprehensible, divine emanated / created the cosmos, if that's the sfirot, what does this structure look like? How should we visualize it? How should we imagine it? So here we have a question to which the Kabbalists had multiple answers, and it's fair to say that the tree was only one possible or one candidate for most appropriate visualization of the spherotic structure. I think it's fair to say that the competing structure that may have even been dominant in the earliest period of the emergence of Kabbalah in the 12th and 13th century was actually not a tree at all, but rather the schema or the figure of concentric circles that we associate with the medieval and really ancient astronomical system. So we see, for example, this is a quote from Moses Cordovero, the 16th century Sapphidian Kabbalist, speaking about a scheme in which the sfirot are pictured as nested concentric circles. He said, what is the essence and signification of this form? And then he basically invokes astronomy to explain that the divine spheres are, and note the similarity between the terms spheres and sfirot. It's a similarity to which I devoted an article that was published a couple of years ago in Harvard Theological Review, which didn't end up in my book, but should be accessible to all of you with university credentials if you're interested in the subject. But this is an astronomical justification for the model of the Sfirot as concentric circles. And in fact, the Kabbalists, perhaps surprisingly to many people today who've become accustomed to thinking of the Kabbalah as mysticism, I even myself allowed myself to speak about Jewish mysticism, which is something I'm often careful to avoid, because the Kabbalists themselves would not have appreciated being called mystics. They would have much rather been described in almost all cases as scientists of the divine, or scientists of the occult, or practitioners of the occult science. Occult science in Hebrew is chokhmat hanistar. So I'm not using a kind of late theosophical terminology here anachronistically, but actually authentic Kabbalistic language. And as people whose self-conception was as men of science, it was perfectly natural from their point of view to appropriate the dominant infographics of medieval science from the most prestigious branches of medieval science, of natural philosophy and astronomy. From astronomy, of course, they borrowed the concentric circles and imagined the Sfirot to be continuations of the structure of the cosmos, as it was known to scientists of specializing in astronomy, which also, by the way, is a science of the invisible, not so different in some respects to Kabbalah. From natural philosophy, they adopted the tree. And so that's a bit of a spoiler, but I'll get back to it. But I want to spend a moment or two on concentric circles before we reach the Kabbalistic tree. This is a diagram from the very earliest Kabbalistic manuscript to have reached us, that was copied from a Spanish manuscript already in the 1200s, in the late 13th century in Rome, or possibly somewhere else in Italy. As you can see, it's now in Parma. But it's fair to say, it's pretty much the oldest Kabbalistic diagram of the Sfirot. And it's one that has never really gone out of use. It has been also transvalued over time and come to signify different things in different schools of Kabbalah. But fundamentally, what it is an acrostic of the 10 Sfirot, taking the first letter of each of the 10 fundamental names of the Sfirot and shaping that letter in such a way that they could be nested within one another, so as to convey the image of concentric circles, which is the ultimate cosmological image in the Middle Ages. So I don't know how easily one can see. Oh my goodness, I didn't mean to do that. I was trying to see if I could show you with my mouse, but it doesn't matter. They were 10 circles, but just not so circular. But you see this is also, okay, it's a 16th century copy, but there are much earlier copies as well, including the Parma manuscript that I've inserted alongside it. Here you can see, again, in another way, the extent to which Kabbalists felt that the cosmological model was compelling and important. And so when listing the 10 Sfirot, as they did, just trying to figure out if there's a way I can do, how do I do a kind of the equivalent of a laser pointer on this without making it advance? I don't know. Anyway, doesn't matter. You can see I've marked it. The 10 Sfirot are the 12 o'clock column, but it's important for them to point out that they parallel sort of Jewishy things like the 10 Commandments and the 10 creative speech acts of Genesis, as well as 10 really important body parts, but most fundamentally 10 spheres that are identified at on the 10 o'clock diagonal. And the fact that a cosmological astronomical model is at the base of this visualization is made perfectly clear by the fact that Earth is at the center of this diagram of the spherot. Other natural philosophical diagrams were also adopted by Kabbalists. They are less commonly reproduced in Kabbalistic works, but they do find their way there. I am still interested in this particular one, and I haven't quite gotten to the bottom of it yet. But these really foundational text of natural philosophy by Isidore of Seville includes a diagram at the center of which you can see in Latin, mundus annus homo, or world, year, person, which you may recall me invoking when speaking of the 10 sfirot of Sefer Yetzirah, the six directions or vectors of three-dimensional space, world, time, and value that people bring, good and bad. So Sefer Yetzirah has the same breakdown as Isidore of Seville, and in commentaries on Sefer Yetzirah that we find from the Middle Ages, Isidore's diagram is reproduced. So here you can see Pseudo Sadia, commentary on Sefer Yetzirah, and here's a somewhat later invocation of the same in an early modern Hebrew cosmological text. So very close association between, maybe surprising to some of you, was surprising to me when it first impressed itself upon my mind, but between Kabbalah and natural philosophy. So, and you see, this is a frame taken from a long rhodoless Kabbalistic tree, in which you see still, even though this rhodoless includes some arboreal diagrams, it's the ongoing investment in this concentric circle model of the cosmos, including the structure of the divinity that is beyond the astronomical cosmos. But ultimately, the most popular and widely received and reproduced visualization of the Kabbalistic system of 10 sfirot was the Kabbalistic tree. Now, here's where I have to be sober and say the Kabbalistic tree is not a mythological tree of life reference. It's not similar to the Christians who say that Jesus's cross was made from the tree in the Garden of Eden. But in fact, the Kabbalistic tree is a natural philosophical tree, primarily indebted to what are called Porphyrian trees that are known by that name because of their association with Porphyry's commentary on Aristotle's categories. And these are infographics that do a great job of visually representing the relationships between things, between their causal relationships, their centrality versus peripherality. All kinds of relationships can be represented with arboreal diagrams. On the left, you're seeing a wonderful example of a diagram that I think many people, if they just looked at it quickly, would probably nowadays say, oh, that's a Kabbalistic tree. But in fact, it's a tree of Jesse in a medieval manuscript that is devoted to reconciling different genealogies of Christ in the Gospels. On the right, you see more about the arbor of porphyry and basically how it works. In the most common model, going from the most abstract mode of being to the most concrete iteration of being in a particular person. So you have philosophical uses, you could say, genealogical uses. You have also some relation to squares of opposition. These are also used in many treatises of logic. And associated with the genealogical applications are historical applications, most famously represented in the Middle Ages by the manuscripts of Peter of Poitiers' genealogy of Christ. And these have long trees that map out the genealogies of Christ and popes and kings and all of that. And sometimes they look a lot like Kabbalistic trees, but as we'll see a little bit, more like late, early modern, or even modern Kabbalistic rotuli, rather than more proximate medieval manuscripts of Kabbalistic trees. So, I hope that's not a big bummer for everyone to hear that Kabbalistic trees are appropriations of natural philosophical infographics and not trippy tree of life symbols. But Kabbalists place a great emphasis on the importance of making these images, these diagrams. This quote I translated from a very interesting manuscript, a 15th century Italian introduction to Kabbalah, which concludes with a final course project in which those learning Kabbalah are asked to make themselves a very complex manuscript arboreal diagram that would be quite a project. But let me give you a sense of what a classical medieval Ilan is the Hebrew word for tree, what it looked like. And indeed, I'm putting this up here on the board for a moment. The Kabbalistic tree in Hebrew is called an Ilan. And this term Ilan, or baum in Hebrew, tree in English, it's the way of referring to this type of diagram, just like we know what we mean when we talk about a Venn diagram. So this is a tree diagram. A tree diagram typically has medallions and that are networked by channels. That's what a tree diagram is. And as I've written in various publications and won't bore you with now, I was fascinated to see that even when Kabbalists use tree metaphors to talk about the Sfirot, and then even in close proximity provide a diagram, they don't connect the metaphor to the diagram. So again, the tree here really is a reference to a schema, rather than to a botanical tree. And in fact, Kabbalistic trees, much less so than Christian trees of virtues and vices and Jesse and whatever, they're very rarely phytomorphic, meaning they very rarely are embellished decoratively to bring out their treeness, their vegetative state. You're seeing in the background one of the earliest surviving parchments that's today housed in the Vatican, but the text that is on top of it is taken from the beginning of the chapter in the Summa, written in the mid-16th century by Moses Cordovero of Kabbalah up to his own time. And it's the chapter that treats how one should visualize the spherotic array. And so he says it's treating the forms of the sphirot, using a term often associated with, it was used to translate form in Hebrew translations of Aristotelian and Platonic texts. Treating the forms of the sphirot, in other words, the order of their arrangement, the opinions are manifold. In other words, there are many ways of visualizing the 10 sphirot. And the Kabbalists have drawn these forms on parchments and refer to them as Ilan, as a tree. So he also is recognizing the existence of a genre. And that's a word I haven't said yet. I would say tonight, except that you're in the afternoon. Haven't said it yet, but this is a genre I'm talking about, not simply an arboreal diagram, but my book especially, and my research is especially focused on the genre called Kabbalistic trees, or Ilanot, Kabbaliyim, and they are big parchments that have diagrams and a lot of inscriptions on them. So just very quick show and tell. These are examples taken from Cordovero's chapter showing how many different ways Kabbalists have pictured the constellation of the Sphirot. I'm avoiding saying the different ways they've pictured the Kabbalistic tree, because the Kabbalistic tree is only one way of visualizing the constellation of Sphirot. So this is the Sphirot as an Aleph, kind of an anthropomorphic Aleph. And Cordovero says this isn't really meant to visualize what the actual array or constellation, but has a symbolic meaning. He makes a distinction between symbolic and the actual constellation and what its structure is like. Then he says, some people think it's a circle based on a text in Sefer Yetzirah, that their end is fixed in their beginning. But he says this is also wrong. And in the text in Sefer Yetzirah should be understood differently. He makes different diagrammatic images to show what he thinks Sefer Yetzirah means in that passage. Then he starts getting into what really could be seen as rudimentary expressions of what will become the Kabbalistic tree. We don't have medallions and we don't have networked channels connecting those medallions, but it's a very short step from there, and Christian texts, even of manuscripts of Peter of Poitiers, don't always include the medallions and the channels either. So there's a kind of short form tree, you might say. And here he just says there are people who have arrayed the different attributes differently, and each one has a different signification. He kind of scores them. He's not he's partisan. One of the roles he took for himself in writing this Summa was to be the arbiter of what's true, to basically say what was out there, but no less importantly, give the bottom line. This is one that he really gives his thumbs up to is really the right way to go, and it ultimately becomes the Kabbalistic tree that is most famous and most familiar to any of you who've seen Kabbalistic trees, including Dr. Landau's image from the last presentation. And that is three triangulated sets of three sphirot, one pyramidal, and the others reversed, with a 10th at the bottom that refers to that's the lowest of the 10. And I won't be able to get into the symbolic valence of it, but there's also a model in which the three upper sphirot are a tower rather than a triangle. And that has a philosophical justification, because these are considered the highest realms of the divine, and the philosophically inclined Kabbalists say that one couldn't possibly make such crass distinctions as right and left when referring to such recondite realms of the divine. Here you're getting a very quick glimpse of what I call the magnificent parchment, or a magnificent parchment, a family of manuscripts that was particularly popular around the year 1500, but these manuscripts were copied well into the 17th century, and they have over 33,000 words of text, a number of secondary diagrams, many of them also arboreal, but the Italians, who are very philosophical by and large in their approach to Kabbalah, got behind the tower rather than triangulated Kabbalistic tree. And what you're seeing now on the projection are the three uppermost sfirot of the magnificent parchment. And now I'll scroll it for you so that you can see. Now it's getting into more familiar territory of the lower seven sfirot of a Kabbalistic tree. The bottom one is sitting on a throne of glory, which is atop a kind of astrological zodiac that represents the sub-divine, the sub-spherotic realm, the realm of the intellect, and the planetary bodies, and the sublunar realm of the four elements and the earth. So, okay, so now I really have to bring this in for a conclusion. And I didn't want to just be so negative and say, you know, what's the word? I didn't want to do whatever it is on the party. I forget, it might be a vulgar expression. I've been out of the States for a while. But really, no tree. Yossi, you're not going to give us any kind of tree of life, nothing. This is what you came to do to the Tree of Life conference. So, okay, I give you what I can give you. So I found one phytomorphic Kabbalistic tree. You can see this one's got some leaves on it. So that's you have a picture of a Kabbalistic tree with some leaves. So that's very nice. And just a very quick sense of the fact that the tree is an important metaphorical or cosmological image in Kabbalistic texts. It just doesn't happen to be closely associated with the picture of the Kabbalistic tree that we're talking about right now. But this is an extraordinary text from a kind of proto-Kabbalistic. It's hard to describe it. The Bahir is a book that's often classified as the first Kabbalistic book. And if that's true, that's fine with me. But it's before the systematization of Kabbalah that we see happening in the 13th century. And you see this beautiful passage with God speaking about this tree that is basically, excuse me, a kind of it's a demiurgic tree that is almost divine itself. I was alone when I made it. No angel can raise himself above it. Who was there with me to whom I would have confided this secret? This is the all tree of the Bahir. Sholem wrote about it extensively. Elliot Wolfson wrote about it. So there's much one can read for those interested. Another passage in the Bahir is linking it to material from Sefer Yetzirah, something that Kabbalists often do, but this could be a kind of internal development of the previous passage about the all tree, now making the tree into the fundamental cubic space of reality, or at the core of reality. So that's a bit of tree thinking in Kabbalah. And I did want to show that Kabbalistic trees do sometimes include the tree of life, even though the Kabbalistic tree is itself not a tree of life, sorry. So this is a very special and interesting Kabbalistic tree that was copied by a Christian Hebraist by the name of James Hepburn, at the request of oh my goodness, I'm speaking too extemporaneously, and it's too late at night here. Tony Grafton and Joanna Weinberg wrote a book about him with Princeton University Press a few years ago. It'll come to me as soon as I stop trying to think of it. But in any case, this was a copy made of a very early Kabbalistic tree, and it was embellished not a little by James Hepburn in the process. And you can see that at the very bottom, he has a frame in which he pictures on the right, the tree of life, and on the left, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Another example of the tree of life on a Kabbalistic tree can be found on a fascinating parchment crafted in 1533 in Venice by two figures of the age, Menachem Khalfan and Avram Tzorfati, and much can be said about it. And about all of these things, you can read more in my book if you like. But this has very unusually a kind of illuminated manuscript picture embedded upon the parchment, in which you can see Adam and Eve with the devil approaching on dragon back to encourage them to eat from the one tree. And in fact, there are classical rabbinic traditions according to which, in fact, there really was only one tree in the garden rather than two trees, but you could say how you used it made it all the difference. And Adam and Eve are about to eat from the tree of life here. And the texts around it also get into the story a little bit. But again, no connection is made between this image and the image of the Sfirot. That's important. The only Kabbalistic tree that I have discovered so far, and I have been at it for a few years, that calls itself a tree of life is an 11-meter, I may be speaking to Americans, I should say 11-yard, roughly 11-yard rotalis created in the very early 19th century by one of the great rabbis of Baghdad named Sasson ben Mordechai Shanduch. And Rabbi Shanduch made actually a series of Ilanot, a series of long Kabbalistic trees. And his apparently the latest one that has reached us with this gorgeous opening frame calls itself Tofes Ilana Dechaye Lekuchebrichu Ushchinte, the image of the tree of life for the unification of the Holy Blessed One and his Shekhinah, the divine presence. And you're seeing here this bright red, roughly oval form bursting with orange flowers outlined in green, and it hovers over the uppermost diagrammatic element of the rotalis. And this title basically is declaring this Kabbalistic tree to be the image of the tree of life. And its raison d'etre is nothing less than the unification of the Holy Blessed One and the Shekhinah, which is the ultimate tikkun, or enhancement or repair of the cosmos that the Kabbalah charges all of us with carrying out. So it's a very apt way of describing it and very poetic, but unique. And in fact, it's quite interesting that Shanduch in Baghdad received a lot of Kabbalistic books that were published in the West, many books published in for example, in Livorno and in Frankfurt, but he does not seem to have received Kabbalistic tree manuscripts because his is very unusual, especially over its 11 meters, in not showing the influence of the common trees that were circulating in his day. So the person who had the least exposure to the genre of Kabbalistic trees, but nevertheless, in a way, created the genre for himself, for his own cosmological representations, is the one who calls the Kabbalistic tree the image of the tree of life. Okay, my title, which I gave long before I just knew what I was going to talk about today, included the term magic, and it's only right that I say at least a word about magic before I leave at least a couple of minutes for questions, I hope. Where's the magic? It turns out that very late in the 19th century, for the first time, Kabbalistic tree rotuli, or long vertical scrolls, were repurposed to serve as amulets. One could speak about magical understandings of such artifacts in the earlier period. I neglected to say that the earliest Kabbalistic trees as a genre emerge in the 14th century already. So from the 14th century to the 19th century, we don't have tree amulets, but you could say defensively, I think, that they were perceived as talismanic in their potential for making present that which they signified through their images. But in terms of like a down and dirty amulet to keep you safe from harm, that's a 19th century, late 19th century innovation. And you're seeing the very bottom of one of them now, which includes the bit about what it's good for. Here, another one that I magically took while using my two hands to hold the little parchment open. These scrolls, by the way, are miniaturized. With very few exceptions, the amulet redeployments are miniaturizations of the larger scrolls that were actually used by Kabbalists for contemplation and study. On the right, you're seeing an amulet that I wouldn't classify as a Kabbalistic tree at all, but just to show you that sometimes magical amulets will include the scheme, the schema of the Kabbalistic tree. So I'm obviously, you could tell I could go on for a long time on this topic, but I'm just going to say thank you and encourage anyone who wants to learn more such nonsense to have a look at my book, The Kabbalistic Tree, which came out just a couple of months ago. I'm happy to share the secret that if you go to the publisher's website, which is Penn State University Press, you can use the code Ilanot, I-L-A-N-O-T, to get a secret 30% discount on this book, which is a bit expensive because it's big and gorgeous and has 260 plus glossy images and fold out pages. But I'm gonna end that plug now and thank you and ask for any questions in the last few minutes of this hour. Sorry, I spoke longer than I should have.
Thanks very much. Very rich wisdom and imagery. I took a lot of pictures of your slides.
It's all online. Go to ilanot.org. You can find everything I do is online, and including editions, translations of all these Ilanot. There's a lot there already.
Okay. I also like your the use of the PowerPoint dynamics here, the dynamism in your presentation. I have one question. I saw in 2 or 3 the images that of the Sfirot, that instead of chesed, it said gedula, opposite gevura. So that's the first time I've encountered that. So what does that signify as opposed to chesed?
It
All the
really
others seem to be the standard ones we know.
No, sometimes you'll see pachad instead of gevura. Those are the two that most frequently swap out for alternatives, gedula and chesed and gevura and pachad. But I've never clocked a real difference in signification. They are basically interchangeable, and you see even sometimes copyists will change one to another. It seems, I haven't really looked into it so carefully, but it seems to be maybe a kind of regional or temporal preference, but the symbolism is not impacted by this. The weirder thing that if you were looking closely, you might have noticed when I was doing that review was that there are people who think that you should switch right and left so that chesed or love, gedula, grandeur is on the left side rather than the right. And they get into a whole thing about how as the image, if the sphirot are the image of the divine and you're looking then at an image of the divine, why is the right side of the divine on that image placed in what would be the left of the divine if the divine was facing you? If you catch my drift. So then you see there's this whole thing about perspective. What are we seeing God face to face, or are we seeing God from behind? It also has some biblical antecedents with, right? Moses,
for sure, from Moses,
rock. Right. So
well, thanks,
that's sure.
Yishar Koach, very fascinating. Thanks.
Yeah.
Other questions from the side of it?
Hi, this is Andrea Celli. Vertiginous presentation, and yeah, I'm in contemplation of what we heard. But I have a minor question. I was wondering if you still would use Christian Kabbalah as a label to talk about some authors and texts. And yeah, yes, perhaps I had a small other question, but yeah, now I don't remember it. Come back.
Okay. I think that I think it's a label that should be used thoughtfully and discerningly, and in keeping with self-understanding and oeuvre of the particular figure being discussed. So, for example, in recent work on Postel, it has been suggested by Judith Weiss, that he is not well served by such a categorization. He may have been a Christian who was interested in Kabbalah, among other things, but it's a bit too strong to say that he was a Christian Kabbalist. And so again, there certainly is such a thing as Christian Kabbalah. I don't deny it. And in fact, although I couldn't in my research make Christian Kabbalah into a focal point, because it's a vast subject. And in fact, the Christians were avid image makers, shouldn't surprise us. But if I were going to extend my study of visual Kabbalah to include Christian Kabbalah, to be responsible to Christian Kabbalah, it would have taken me another 20 years to write the book, and it would have been 7 times the size. So what I did do in my own work was to look for places of convergence, of intersectionality, I think is a popular term today, between Jewish and Christian Kabbalah on this issue. And the most significant site for that convergence I found in the 17th century work of Christian Knorr von Rosenroth, Kabbalah Denudata, because Rosenroth collected Lurianic Ilanot, or Kabbalistic trees, in the middle of the 17th century. And since most of these manuscripts are undated, it was useful to me to see what was out there by the 1670s and presented by Knorr. So yeah, I think it's a legitimate term to be used with care and sensitivity, but absolutely a real thing. And there are many fine scholars of Christian Kabbalah. It's very rare to find a scholar of Christian Kabbalah who has equal fluency in Hebrew, Jewish Kabbalah, just as it's very rare to find scholars of Jewish Kabbalah who have the fluency in Latin and Christian sources to really treat Christian Kabbalah with the proper skill set. So it's an area that's ideal for kind of collaboration between people with different skill sets, since there are few of us anymore in the world that are Renaissance men and women who have all of these things at their fingertips.
I think we have one more question from inside the room.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name is Greg Prida. I'm speaking later today, art historian, and I loved your talk. So please forgive me if this question is totally irrelevant. I have little knowledge in Lurianic Kabbalah, but I was struck by that one diagram from Padma when you were talking about spheres, Svarim, I can't remember the term.
Yes.
And it was so linear. And I thought about all these concentric circles and lines, and it reminded me of the term Tzimtzum. And I came to your talk late, so maybe you discussed this, but I was wondering to what extent that comes up or how relevant that might be for these people thinking about scientific mysticism or scientific theology, because it's like this idea of separation. Like it just looked like a map, like this labyrinth. And I was just wondering if that is at all relevant in thinking about separation or contraction. Might the tree be at the place where that separation takes place as like this cosmic center, or is that just complete flight of fancy?
I can say that in this, I spoke too long and I still didn't say enough, because it's a big subject. It's 700 years of manuscripts produced in Yemen, Kurdistan, Poland, England, Italy, Germany, North Africa. So I mean, I couldn't do it justice. One of the things that I had to ignore was a fundamental difference between classical Ilanot and Lurianic Ilanot. Classical Ilanot being just images of the 10 Sfirot. Those are what you saw for the most part in my presentation. I think maybe exclusively, I showed classical Ilanot. And although classical Ilanot were still copied in late into the early modern period, in the 17th century, Lurianic Kabbalists adopted the genre and kind of rebooted it to serve their needs. And it's only in the Lurianic Ilanot from the mid 17th century and later that you get the visualizations of Lurianic doctrines, including Tzimtzum, including so what you're talking about is a real thing, but I didn't actually show any pictures of it tonight or this afternoon. And it's also true that if you look at what's going on in the 17th century, that, for example, Knorr's work is of great interest to the scientific community of his era. There's the work of Alison Couder on Leibniz in the Kabbalah is one entree to this subject of the extent to which the Cambridge Platonists, Henry Moore especially, but Leibniz and to a lesser extent, Isaac Newton, were fascinated by Kabbalah and regarded Kabbalah as some kind of in the wake of Agrippa, but some kind of Pythagorean mysticism that the Jews had carried without a true understanding, but the Jews had somehow managed to keep alive an otherwise forgotten Pythagorean mystery tradition. This was something that some of the great figures of 17th century science embraced, if only temporarily. Henry Moore and Isaac Newton, for example, were disillusioned by the Kabbalah the more they found out about it. But nevertheless, that interface was there, that engagement was there. And Kabbalah Denudata remained popular for a long time with Western intellectuals. My friend Paul Franks, who's in the philosophy department at Yale, has worked on Kabbalah Denudata's influence on Hegel, for example. So unexpected impact. So it's a bit hard for me to answer your question with the specificity about that Parma. The Parma diagram you saw isn't Lurianic, and it doesn't show Tzimtzum. So, and in general, I'm a pretty boring historian with maybe a sexy topic, but a boring approach to it. I try to only say what the texts the texts that are adjacent to or embedded in the diagram tell me that it is. I offer minimal conjectures because, as you could see from what I did show tonight, that a tree diagram could be a tree of Jesse or a tree of Aristotle's categories or a tree of Sfirot. And the only way you can know is by reading the text. So to avoid fantasy, which is nice in some realms of life, but as an American trained academic, I try to avoid in my professional work. I stay close to the text and what they tell me.
One more quick question from online, and it's a technical one. What program did you use to create your presentation? And the related comment is the way in which you highlighted the manuscripts helps to reinforce the notion of the Kabbalistic tree as an early infograph.
Thank you.
Infographic, sorry.
Yeah, I've been going back and forth in recent years, and until I think when I think about the presentation, I choose between Apple's Keynote software, which is their alternative to PowerPoint. I find a little more elegant than PowerPoint as an Apple user since 1983. And I also use Prezi sometimes now, and I appreciate that the people liking the dynamism that I put into a keynote presentation. If you saw what I do with Prezi, you might get nauseous, or you might get even more excited by the possibilities. But each one has its advantages and disadvantages, and I'll be giving a talk at a conference in Venice in a few days, and I'm making a Prezi for that. The Prezi is very nice because it gives you a kind of dynamic desktop. It's non-linear, and you can kind of go all over the place on the desktop. But I thought this would be good for a Zoom, and it seems to have worked. So I appreciate it. Yes, the Kabbalistic tree is an infographic at the end of the day.